Thanks. I know I'm the last person bringing up the rear, so I will do my best to go as fast as possible so that you won't get bored with what I have to say. I will say really quickly, I'm happy to be here in Melbourne with our official sister city of Durban, South Africa, our co-founders of the Connecting Delta Cities Network through C40, ourselves in Melbourne, who have a long history together through C40 of addressing a lot of these issues. So happy to be here, and I'm going to try to go through this at a clip so we can get to more interesting things besides me talking. First, I'd like to say that, as others have said, I am not the expert on this topic. I'm a city planner and have been doing work for a long time, but I did bring the expert on that topic with me, who works in partnership with us, Dr. Josh Lewis, who is sitting in the audience. So some of this work builds on his work, and I'll just sort of give an overview of what's going on. The first piece to think about as it relates to New Orleans is that we're a coastal city, we're a delta city, and the confluence of the Mississippi River, which is the largest system in the United States, to the Gulf of Mexico, defines both our geography and the biodiversity of the city and where we sit, and frankly the biodiversity that existed for years and years and years before Europeans discovered the Native Americans, who had already been living on the land and living with that environment. So as I said before, the Mississippi River system drains 40% of the continental United States, and 25% of U.S. Exports are shipped through the 5 major ports of Louisiana that go from the mouth of the river up to an end at the city of New Orleans. In context, the city is 169 square miles, or 438 square kilometers, but over a third of that land is wetlands, and that's the really important piece to think about as we tell the story of New Orleans, is that for much of its history, New Orleans was the city itself, the urbanization, was but a small piece of the larger geography of the area, and over time that has continued to move out and cause massive disruption to biodiversity, and also has given us the situation that we have today and how we have to cope with the environment. But as you can see, even today, a third of that land is wetlands, and of course, before then, a large majority of what you see in purple was also wetland. So if you look at just the history of the city, I'm a historian, I like to start with history. When the French settled New Orleans in 1718, they found a spot that was on the highland next to the river and lived fairly densely here with what they call La Cyprière, which was the cypress swamps in the back connecting to Lake Pontchartrain to the north, which is actually an estuary of the Gulf of Mexico. So you have this system where you found the highest land, the land that made more sense to live in, not susceptible to flooding, and that's where the city was settled. And really, the settlement of the city went along this high land next to the river for a very long period of time. As you see, the city developed on the high land, not in the swamp, that remained for some time, which allowed for the city to coexist with nature in a way very different than you see in the post-World War II period of the development of the city. So if you zoom to today, this is the coverage of the urbanization of the city and the metropolitan area. What you were looking at before is right here, and what you see today is the coverage of the entire area, most of the former swampland and wetland, with just a bit of it left, which is actually the Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge, which is the largest urban wildlife refuge in the United States. So the challenges to biodiversity really come from our coastal systems. The first piece, saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico, which reduces the ecological diversity in the urban wetland, flood protection systems that are used to protect humans and our physical buildings, also impound urban wetlands and reduce eco-hydrological connectivity. Flood protection systems and urbanization limit freshwater and sediment flows that underpin ecological productivity, soil compaction, and groundwater levels, which is what it's taken for the majority of the history of this land to exist. And you see what we've done to it since then. We've cut off that supply, which has allowed for this condition to take hold, which is saltwater intrusion killing the wetlands and really forming a city that is protected mostly by physical means, and really trying to redirect going back into nature-based solutions of how you protect a city. This is, by the way, the largest surge barrier in the world, which protects the city from the Gulf of Mexico on that side. And you can see it from this way going back into the city, of course designed by our friends in the Netherlands because they like to build these types of things. But it shows, I really like this picture because it shows what makes the most sense. Do we invest $14 billion in a system like this, or do we invest billions of dollars in the natural systems that actually protected this land for thousands of years? And it's sort of a different thinking. What we know, given where we are in history and what we have built, is that we have to take an integrated approach to infrastructure, both gray and green, in order to survive. On the urban system side, as I showed you before, post-World War II development pattern has completely obliterated a good bit of our natural protection. Flooding, land abandonment, socio-environmental inequalities are driving a major invasion by problematic trees and shrubs, which Josh can talk more about, I cannot. Areas with limited repopulation in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina are the ones that are worst affected. Invasive plants are spreading on abandoned lands, which generates problems with rodents, mosquitoes, which is a huge issue for us historically, and illegal dumping, mostly large corporations dumping waste in abandoned lands, in wetlands, because it's just cheaper to do so. And the regulation and the enforcement side, as we saw in a couple other presentations, of really gaining more traction on enforcement is something that we're challenged with. And of course, these sites become seed sources for invasive plants to spread citywide. If you have a plot of land in New Orleans, if you have a house, you actually do identify with this because you see things just sprout out of the ground that you have no idea where it came from, and this is actually happening all over the area. So the population density piece, you can see up until 1940, the city was still relatively compact and not really spreading into the swamplands. What happened since then is, as I call, the scourge of engineering, and we decided that we could pump all of the water out of the urbanized area and start really, starting in the late 1940s, developing into all the area that actually protects the city and protects the watershed. And you can see up to 2010, you can see how two things have happened. The dark colors are dense, the density, the lighter colors less dense. So you can see up to 2010, the density of the core city has reduced and it's spread across the landscape. This is a picture of the lower Ninth Ward after Hurricane Katrina, and you can see what we were talking about in terms of the invasive species on the abandoned lands, and as things have not come back, nature is starting to take over, although it may not have been the nature that you thought of before, and what that's doing to the ecosystem. The way we're addressing this really quickly, and I won't go into great detail about this, but the multiple lines of defense strategy, which starts at the Gulf of Mexico, the barrier islands and the wetlands, the land bridges that exist, the natural ridges that are the areas where original indigenous people actually lived. Then you have the highways, the flood systems, water management, internal and evacuation routes, to form sort of an ecosystem of how the city operates as a part of both a gray and green strategy. This is the strategy that we're moving forward with statewide in Louisiana to protect and to reinvest in the coast. Pursuing the resilience dividend inside the city, looking at reduced risk of flooding and subsidence, but also in developing these projects and using more natural solutions, really investing in neighborhood beautification and economic development. The economic development piece, which was touched on by two other presentations, is really important. How do you really think about your investments, not just as investments in the infrastructure or the nature-based solution itself, but an investment in people, and understanding that there are people who actually build these things, and how do we train populations, particularly disadvantaged populations who are disconnected from the workforce. How do we train those populations in order to be able to get the skills they need to participate in the rebuilding of green infrastructure in particular, which is sort of a more progressive thinking about what the economy will be in the future, so they're prepared to participate in the economy going forward. So really thinking of the social, the physical, and the environmental all together is the way we really have to approach these things. Recreation and health and environmental awareness. We do a lot of work with children. we made a decision early on that some adults we just could not change. But like the recycling movement in the United States started with children. I was one of those children that brought things home, and we talked to our parents about, oh, we should recycle. That's actually how that movement got started in the United States, was based in children and children's education. And so we're starting with children. We're, of course, educating adults, but it's more effective to talk to children because they're the ones who are living today and learning today and will really outlast all of us. So we've taken a really big approach on children. And then the final piece I'll talk about is really the overall scope of what it is that we're trying to do, is taking an urban delta vision of how to rebuild a city and rebuild a community and integrate nature back into the city. We're really relearning what we already knew and what we really have undone since 1940. So reintroducing the natural into the urban through integrated solutions, gray and green solutions. So we know we can't move the city. We know that frankly, we are not building on any new parts of the city, so we're not expanding, we're reinvesting in what we already have. And so how do we reinvest in the city as it exists today? So this is actually an existing street in the city, Elysian Fields Avenue. And how do you work with the planning scheme to create additional density on corridors, areas that already have access to transit. We have these large medians in New Orleans that at one point many of them were canals for drainage purposes closed in. How do we repurpose those canals not just for greater transit between parts of the city, but also so that they can take away a lot of the flooding issues that we have in our rainstorms like you had here the past day. So really thinking about the solutions integrated so that we can do a number of things, not just one thing or two things, to create the future city that we want. Another example is a large 25-acre, to use the imperial system, a 25-acre site in an area of the city that was built in the 1950s that was not in a former swamp area, and reintroduce some form of nature into the city that can reduce the flooding in this part of the area, capturing the rainfall while also adding additional environmental benefits and having a place for a lot of species, and Josh actually does a lot of work in this area, to be able to thrive. It's a really important piece of how do you reintroduce nature into the city, and how do you take a city that's already built and start thinking about how you can change it to really move forward on some of the things that you'd like to do. And that's my presentation. I tried to wrap up as fast as I could.